Hello, everybody. Welcome to In Our Community. My name's Marc Potter, and we're visiting today with poet Jade Bradbury. Jade is very well known here in the South Bay. She's a wonderful poet from Los Gatos, and she has a book out called In the Willing Dirt, which is a fascinating book. How many years have you been writing poetry, Jade?
Well, as we all like to say, and it is true in my case, all my life. I think
Oh, very beautiful.
I think from the time that my parents read poetry to me as a child, I, wanted to write poetry. In a way,
Okay.
you might be born to these things. It's hard to say, but I've sure been at it for a lot of years.
So that's what drew you to it, your parents reading it to you as a child, you're saying? Or
Absolutely,
okay.
absolutely. They read a lot of Robert Louis Stevenson. The kinds of poems that people read to children post World War II.
Okay.
Um, and it's also a very southern thing. I was born and raised in Mississippi and
Oh,
other parts
really?
of the South.
Oh, my goodness.
And so that whole business about storytelling and about reading and poetry, those things I think come part and parcel uh, with an awful lot of Southern folks.
Okay. When you were younger, did you have, I know you've got a long list of poets that you admire. Who were some of the people in the very beginning of your poetic life that you were attracted to as writers?
I don't know if I could go back to the very beginning, to childhood, although I do remember some of there was one about the little boy's uh, quilt being a boat, and that was where he went at night, and wink and blink and a nod, things like that. But later on, when I heard Emily Dickinson's poems for the first time, I was maybe in late grade school or middle school.
Okay.
I said, wow, wow, that is a poem. And not only
Yeah.
that, but it really hit me somewhere. It did
Yeah.
every single one of them.
She's one of our greatest poets, one of the greatest American poets ever. So I'm fascinated by the theme of nature in your poetry. And would you like to read a poem and then tell us how the nature aspect um, relates in that particular piece? You
Uh,
have one with the word grass in the title?
oh, I do. Just happened to have that to hand.
I heard a rumor. I heard a rumor about this.
So in the little chapbook, there are a number of poems that all
Yes.
of them actually are nature oriented, but this one is particularly so. All flesh is grass. My therapist friend suggests I'm the product of my gut. Ardent archivist, modern hunter-gatherer, saver of seeds and proofs of life. I who compulsively collect, record, sample, preserving the stuff of streams, of mountains, of objects, to extend and sustain the slender prospect of living on earth forever. But isn't this a calling, I ask, an expression of love? Look at me, she says, and listen closely. 2 words, dysfunctional loyalty. I'm dumbstruck, saddened by what is undeniable, my error, by what is in the midst of everyday detritus and its drive toward crushing decay. My activity feels urgent, charged with purpose, as if some redemption, graceless redemption, depends upon it. Meanwhile, anxious spawns of blooming molds and shimmering dews bring down mountains, walls, and the heart's arterial pathways, tugging them back to their starts. And what prevails despite my impermanence is rescued by a man-made image, an artifact, whose presence offers, if not respite, evidence that suffering proves a way along the curve of eternity. And I say, I know this means I'm not ever, and was briefly, never unique, yet bound to live and die in this space, sheltered by what remains, salvaged by what abides. All flesh is grass.
Very beautiful, very beautiful. I love your poetry so much.
So nature comes in there, you know. The Bible gives us a passage in more than one place about grass and flesh. What we're talking about, of course, is the nature of life, the round of life. And so this poem begins by addressing how important life is to the poet on this earth, but also the recognition that eternity is also a part of this scene and that it takes that to bring everything about. So, you know, there is a redemption a little bit implied there.
Okay, that's very, very beautiful. So I understand you, when you were in college, you got serious about poetry, right?
A little before that, because in
Okay.
high school I was generally on the editorial team for the poetry booklet that we put out.
Okay. Okay.
I think I did that maybe in junior high also.
Okay.
But then in college, I took poetry classes with a poet, Howard McCord, at that time, and you know, met poets like Robert Bly, met poets, went to workshops with that teacher, that professor, and really felt like I wanted to be a poet. Then came the Vietnam War, which meant I had a small child and a
Ah,
husband. So a lot of things had to be put on hold in terms of life, but it was not anything I left behind totally.
yeah. Wow. That's amazing. What was it like what's it like going to a writers conference like that with someone as famous as Robert Bly?
You know, I was so unacquainted with what that would be like that I didn't even know to be afraid. I should have been. I remember being a
Good for
very
you.
raw piece of work there. But I would say it was very exciting because we all got in a microbus. There were about, I think, 6 or 8 people from the class, and the professor drove us there.
Okay.
And it was in Montana, just over
Oh
the.
my goodness.
We drove across from Washington State University in Eastern Washington,
Wow.
and it was a weekend there. I learned a great deal, which is how very much of a beginner I was. But that's okay. It's
Yeah,
always
yeah. So I want to tie this into what it's like for writers who haven't gotten published or want to figure out how to make those connections. And I'm one of those people. I recoil as a poet from, all the stuff, the criticism or the big name poets. How do we as poets walk that walk, not just writing our poems, but how do we figure out how to get published?
everyone's
I,
question.
I may
But,
be
but,
taking this out
but
of
the good
order.
news, the really good news today is that the access is so much because we can go online and can be published online. Uh,
Yeah,
um, the access is there, and when we're not in a pandemic, the access is there through our cities. Many of our South-based cities have a poet laureate program, meaning that each city has a poet laureate, and that person is a hardworking person for 2 to 3 years who will come and do workshops, free workshops, will work with you, help you find places to submit. You can go to readings, and even now during the pandemic, we have Zoom and we can go to readings. We can go and listen to other poets, read other poets. We have access. You can ask Google to give you any poet's poem just about. It means that you have clues, and when you go to a publisher online, they will tell you in no uncertain terms what they are and are not looking for.
okay. That's
So
good. No, that's great. That's good news because I'm trying to help poets who are kind of afraid of the process to be willing to take some steps toward sharing their work. Some people share their stuff on social media. Do you recommend that or not?
well, it depends on your intent. There are some concerns you might have, and that is that if you would wish, for instance, if you share something online, and you then send that to the publisher will ask you to guarantee that it has not appeared anywhere ever online
Oh,
in
really?
print.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so sometimes you might decide, well, no, I'll read this, but I will not make it available for people to read online.
Now differentiate that. You mean if you made an audio of it, it's different for publishing than if you print it?
Sometimes that could be. Some
Is it?
publishers are extremely specific in that way.
I did not. I really didn't know that for real.
But the main
So,
thing is to take advantage of go to the anytime you see a call for submissions, just do it. Yes, rejection is always a possibility. It truly is. You have to get used to them.
yes, it
Hang
is.
them on your wall and make a collage out of it because it's a learning curve, as they say, and it's worth doing because sometimes somebody will write back to you, seldom, but sometimes they'll write back and say, you know what, I almost took this, but
Oh,
for
geez.
thus and such, and here's why, and then you know what to do the next time. Sometimes they'll ask you to submit again later.
Okay. Now of all the different tiers within publishing, like the chapbooks, the college, university journals, and the big names like Paris Review and New Yorker, how does somebody start working on that? How do they do that? No, I'm serious because I don't, you and I, we're very informal. So if we did this again, we might be talking about giraffes instead. But I want to find out, like I've always been told, try the chapbooks first, the literary chapbooks or literary journals, whatever they're called, and then move up. Is that really a legitimate thing, or should you just go for broke and send something to the New Yorker?
Well, I I have been reading the New Yorker since I was 15 years old. I mean, every single year, and the price of it is outrageous. Yeah, I don't say anything to them. I think that's reaching for the stars, and I'm not quite. My arms aren't quite that long. But I would tell you this: there is nothing. There is absolutely respectability, and having a publisher want to look at your manuscript and wants to do something with your manuscript as a chapbook. I mean, that's 28 poems or so. Usually, it could be a bit more, a bit less. A collection requires at least double that, and many
Okay.
people are not prepared with that many. So part of it is just looking around a little bit, asking other poets, what did you do? Who do you know?
Okay. Okay. So this business of being part of a poetry community is pretty important then.
Absolutely. In fact, I'd say it's everything, and in part why I mentioned the poets laureate, is that that's what they engender, that's what they bring to community, is those opportunities for people to come together in the name of poetry. And I'll tell you, we saw construction workers, children, all sorts of age groups, all sorts of people coming to these gatherings, and we are still united, many of us in smaller groups.
Oh,
Um,
that's great. Wow. That's amazing. That's great. That's wonderful stuff. So what do you? I've got so much material here. I don't know where to go next, frankly. But what is there? What's the topic? What's one of these general topics that you'd like us to cover more deeply, and then we'll dive into that.
well, let's talk about other poets a little bit and what
Okay.
the thing is, what's going on in poetry right now, and why would anyone turn to poetry? I mean, back in 2017 or so, the National um, Teacher Teachers Association, did a survey, and they found out that more people, surprisingly, were reading poems than ever before. In part, they accounted this to the internet, the availability of them on the internet,
Okay.
access, in other words. But they also found that in times of where things are challenging, and especially if they are worldwide, let's talk about pandemics if we want to. Um, People are especially looking for companionship, and the outreach through poetry is more economical than sitting down with a novel and trying to see if that's going to do it.
Right.
Poems sometimes can take you right away, get right to the heart, right to the truth of something that you've been feeling but haven't known how to live with, how to
Oh,
make peace with.
I see. Okay. That's beautiful. Yeah. Okay.
Poetry, poets
Say
are
more about that.
poets are sometimes, and I know I am, looking to make sense of things. Uh,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
sometimes they do it as you do with absurdity, but you very much, I think, are drawn as a poet
Yes. I
to
really am.
make those crazy leaps, and
Yes.
but it does the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. So it helps us make sense of the world. And I like to think that poetry is very nurturing to the soul. And that's someplace that I go with it. So some of the poets that you've liked, you mentioned Joy and Let Me Harjo. Is that how she says it?
Yes,
She's a Native American.
she is, and she is our current U.S. Poet Laureate.
Okay. Is she
First
doing
one, I think.
two after Tracy K. Smith, I guess, did it
Um,
last, right?
yes, that's correct. I
Yeah.
think you're right.
So you like her books and things,
Well,
Joy?
I do, and I'll tell you what, there's a great deal. She's a good example of what I like about many of our indigenous poets. We are beginning to hear from a lot of different tribal cultures. She
Okay.
happens to be Muskogee Creek, and what she shares with us always, always, she begins with nature and she works with truth. And she says those two things are, she in interviews, she says repeatedly, those two things, along with compassion and joy, are what keep her going as a poet. Now, keep in mind that she makes the connection beautifully with a saxophone, with a flute, with her singing voice. When she does a reading, she uses all of those musical instruments to make her poetic sounds as well. Because poetry is music, it affects us much the same way. The word poetry means to make, and
Oh,
the early poets were actually musicians.
oh, really? Okay.
Early, I mean, ancient, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So she's taking us what she's taking us on. She's taking us into the nature of nature and our part in that in a way that is, I think, very much an indigenous perspective, but also anyone who is a nature lover, whether you're John Muir or 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 John
Yeah.
Thompson next door. But what she gives us is that insight. She always
Right,
goes
right.
deep.
That's very beautiful. Is there any of her pieces that you like the most? I have looked her up on YouTube and listened to some of her readings. I like going to YouTube and just typing in the name of the poet, and there are readings at various colleges and stuff that she's done. So
Well, I'd be hard pressed to say one that I like more than another because each time I hear one I haven't heard before, and I have several of her books of poems.
okay, yeah.
On to listen to her in person. She is compelling on the page and in person
Mm.
as poet and musician.
Would you share another one of your poems with us, please?
Let's see here. Let's now I've got bookmarkers in here and we'll see if this works. Okay,
Okay,
here's one. This is a little poem. Um,
okay.
it's titled Journey, and it was written for my daughter who lives in Colorado. When lichens start overtaking stone, the rock does not resist. In fact, submits or doesn't care, preoccupied with simply being there. But lichen time wears away relentlessly, and when at last this blooming leveler has done its reductive deed, all is fluidity, a micro landscape that travels light all down the rivers and into the sea, its mother. She then rimmed with tiny stars upon her moonlit beaches. And what this is about, really,
It's very beautiful. Really is.
it's about the way, again, how nature works. Here are these lichens sitting up there on boulders. You see them when you're driving along country roads or mountain roads.
Right.
And what they're doing is they're putting out some little acids that are working in that thing. It'll reduce it to
Yeah.
smaller stuff that rolls down and so forth. And finally, we find sand on the beach.
Yeah.
They
It's
found out
amazing.
the hard way in LA. They had
Yes.
blocked one of those rivers, and so sand wasn't getting to the beach, and so they had to start importing sand.
Oh boy, that's amazing. That's amazing. That's good. That's good stuff. So we talked a little bit one time about writer's block, and you had something to say about that. What do you please tell us about it? It's a very frustrating thing. I have it sometimes. And so what would you say to a writer who's going through writer's block?
I'd say let's sit down and read. Let's sit down and read together. I guess that's what I would say.
Okay.
Because the block is about pressuring yourself when in fact that seldom brings the result that you would like.
Okay.
I personally, I have to say that really I just don't have enough time to get all the things on the page that I want to. And I
Oh,
seldom experience writer's block, but I have great sympathy for it because most people tell me it's troubling. I mean, I'll admit that when I do continually take classes and workshops to, try to improve, my form and the way I go about
yeah.
things. But what I find over and over again is that when I'm preparing one for class, yeah, something resembling a writer's block comes up a little, mainly
Okay.
because I'm going to share this with people I've come to care about my classmates, and it's raw,
Yes. Yes.
it's
Yeah.
new.
So true.
But we're all afraid of that, aren't we? What we're afraid of
Yes.
is
No,
that
yeah, I go through weeks and sometimes months of just not having it and then it comes out. So, yeah. So now why did you pick writing poetry as the genre of your choice over other genres like being a playwright or being a short story writer or some such thing?
that's a good question. Okay, so, well, I've always been a writer, and as a matter of fact, I've earned my keep in life primarily as one kind of a writer or another. I did publish some individual poems when I was in college and shortly after. Um, and later, when I lived in Los Angeles, I worked in television and movies, and
Okay.
often was hired as a story uh, analyst or and
Television and movies. Oh my goodness.
well, LA is a place that where you don't have to worry about writer's block. I mean, everybody's a writer or an actor or something, and
Okay.
it, for some reason there was always work, and that's kind of an exciting thing. Um, but I would say that the reason I ended up coming back to poetry, really, I mean, well, I worked as a museum curator too, and there's a lot of writing involved there.
Okay. All right.
Also, so prose and certain kinds of story writing, have editing, have served me well. But nothing for me anyway beats having to be economical and still get to the heart of something or attempt to get to the heart of something in the way that poetry can. Its sounds for me are very important. Its rhythms. It's those. That's what makes it stick. I hate to compare it to a TV commercial, but that's what those are about too.
Well, that I haven't heard before in all my years of. That's very cool. That's very
So when
good.
I got sick, in 2012, I was very, very ill,
Yes.
and when
I
that
hope I
happened,
hope to talk more about that in the next show.
okay,
I
so
really do. And I wanted to try to get to the point that being some of the jobs you've done, like being a museum curator, probably spurred your poetry, like it kept it going. And yeah, I would think so. It's just very beautiful stuff. So
all of those things actually made me just want to go home and write poetry, but I was too tired.
yeah, well, we all know of famous poets who did dozens of odd jobs and then used that material to write. So yeah, I think we're coming fairly close to the end of our show. We have a little bit of time left. Is there anything you'd like to say to our audience before we jump into another show? We're going to do a show number two, but anything you'd like to say to leave with the audience?
Ah,
She said, no, nothing. It's like
What
Samuel
what
Beckett.
I'd say is that
Oh,
never be afraid to go to poetry as a resource. No matter who you are, it's very interesting. There's something out there that probably will seem like an answer to you, or like something that will address whatever's bothering,
yeah.
whatever's holding you back. Oh,
Okay.
so yeah,
All
don't
right.
you give it a try.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been visiting today with Jade Bradbury, who has a website called jadebradbury.com, which I'm sure we're going to put on the screen at some point. And I've been your host, Mark Isaac Potter. And thank you so much for watching the show. And we're going to do another show, so tune in on that one. Talk to you soon. Take care. Bye bye.